Welcome, Underdog Leadership Podcast listeners. Jenny Mitchell here with another episode to delight, to inspire, to challenge. And today, my guest is Meghan Rehbein. We are not going to do the whole let's run off the resume and etc. You can find out more about Dr. Rehbein. She is dean at the Douglas College at Rutgers College, the women's college there. You can find out about her on LinkedIn or in our show notes. We are here. If you're hopping in and this is your first episode, just a little plug here that season 3 of the Underdog Leadership Podcast is tied to a collaborative book that each of these guests on this season were a part of, and together rewrote leadership stories that are going to be part of this incredible book that will be birthed like a baby in the fall of 2023. So more coming on that. We're actually recording the podcast in advance of the book arriving. And in the series for the podcast, we've decided to anchor each of the women and each of their stories in 7 key questions. So you can hear Michelle and myself talk about in episode 1 of the season about the process, the experience, what we learned, what was surprised us, and that's episode 1. And now we're here with Meghan to talk more about her story and what she learned and what the experience of writing her collaborative leadership story with other women was like. So first of all, Meghan, that was a long intro. Welcome.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks. I'm thrilled to be back.
Well, it's funny. Connections between leaders when we talk about stuff that matters. We were saying before we recorded that we've only met in person once. Isn't that incredible?
It's crazy because I do feel not only like I know you, but like I've worked with you.
Yeah.
And we haven't worked together. We've worked on projects together, but we haven't worked together. But I feel like I could call you and say, hey, let's talk about the next thing we're going to do.
Yeah. And I think too, I feel like there's a shared sense of like, you'd be a straight shooter. We trust each other. So this is the power of women's leadership in collaboration. I think that's worth marking and just acknowledging here. So we're here to talk about you, Meghan. We're here to talk about your story. So just very briefly, we met in March. We all were in the same room writing these stories, getting some workshops and things. My first question, Meghan, is when you sat down to write this 3,000 word piece, and by the way, folks, she's an accomplished writer. Okay. This woman she's in the academic world. She knows how to write. She knows how to get it done. I remember her from the first call. She said, as long as you give me a deadline, that's what she said to me. Just give me a deadline. I'm good. Right. And she did. Well done, Meghan. So the first question is, what did you think your story was about? And what did it actually end up being about?
I thought I was telling a story about what it felt like to be an interim leader, what it felt like to have that little I word in front of your title. But really what I was talking about is, my own transition from someone who let things happen to her to someone who made things happen. And I don't think I realized that for real until I was about 2/3 of the way through writing. I think I still, even when I sat down and started writing, I thought I was writing about something that happened to me, not my own path to agency. And so that was, it was nice. It was a little journey of kind of self-awareness and I really, when I read it now, because I need to be locked in a room for many, many hours at a time to really write. So a lot of this came in one 5-hour session.
Wow.
And then when I went back to it to read it, I was like, wow, that's like a story, a real story. This is almost like a coming of age story. But it really was kind of coming to agency story for me.
That's been a theme, this idea of a discovery or a self-realization during the writing process. Have you experienced that too?
Yeah, I think there was even a little bit of discovery and self-realization when we met and talked together. One of the one of the things that really helped me in figuring out what this story was,
Yeah.
even in the beginning, was the exercise where we had three of us sit together and one person told their story and the other person listened with the intent to ask questions. And the third person took notes about what we were saying.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
that I think was the genesis of what ended up being the story that I wrote.
Love that.
Yeah.
So everybody's dying to know a high level gist of Meghan's story. So we've entitled this chapter Interim. It just feels right.
Yeah.
There is nothing interim about Meghan Rehbein, by the way, folks. Nothing. So give us a high level. Tell us what it's about.
So twice within 2 years, I had an interim leadership role in the same organization. And when I say it out loud that way, it feels like, what the heck were you thinking? Didn't you learn your lesson the first time? But so this is a story about why I said yes the second time and why I'm no longer with that organization. So, I accepted an interim role originally, applied for the job and did not get it, stayed with the organization, had some really difficult experiences with the person that they did hire the first time around.
Yeah.
And about 14 months after that hire, he left precipitously, and I was placed in an interim role again, and struggled the second time in the interim role because I felt like I knew what I was doing, but I still had that interim in front of my title. And when there was no end in sight to the interim, I chose to leave. And when I was writing this, Jenny, the period that I started writing it, I was still in an interim role at my next organization. So my third interim role in 5 years.
Wow.
That one resolved much more happily, and I am permanently in the role. But I did, there was a point when when we met and when I started writing it, I really was wondering, is interim going to be the thing that I do? I mean, that's a thing. It is. Somebody who comes in, takes an interim role, gets you to the place where you're ready for a permanent and moves on. But it's not what I love. I mean, I love getting an organization really functional, and you can't always do that in an interim role. A lot of times you're holding space. You're keeping the lights on, or you're making all the hard decisions.
Yeah.
So
paving
that you
the
can
way.
be blamed.
Yeah.
Right.
Paving. That's totally
Paving
it.
the way. Yeah.
Oh yeah. And I think you're right about that. I almost think it's the kiss of death, that interim. And I just a plug too. I don't know how many women I've coached where they take on the role of interim. They do the job of theirs and the job of the leader, and they don't even have a salary increase. Can we talk like that? Is just hideous. But to your point, letting things happen to you rather than choosing is one of your themes, right?
Right. It is for sure. And I mean, I will say the first time I took an interim role, I did not get a salary increase. The second time I took an interim role, I had learned that lesson. I knew that I needed to ask for that. It wasn't, it was nowhere near what I would have been making in a permanent role, let alone, 2 salaries since I was doing 2 jobs. But it's these life lessons. They just keep rolling on and on and on. But it ties to the idea. I think about how many women I've talked to who have said, "Well, I got the job, and then they placed me in an interim role," or my first CEO level role, I was an interim CEO, or I was acting
Yeah.
whatever the title is.
Yeah.
And it's a common experience.
Well, and it shows up in your research too, which is, of course,
Yeah.
another pillar of the book. So, what are you going to read for us? I've asked all the women to choose an excerpt. Situate us and take it away.
So I'm going to read a paragraph, just a small piece of the story that for me is, it kind of shows that moment that I realized that I could do, that I could do it, that I could actually do the job, which I don't know that I believed the first time around. So the first time I served as interim leader, I was performing the role, doing what I thought needed to be done to be seen as a leader. The second time around, I was embodying the role. I was the leader. I was it, and I knew it. The doubts that had plagued me when I was faced with the former leader's resume were no longer an issue. I knew that I was better at the job than he was. I had proof in every gift that rolled in, every faculty member that reached out, in every staff member that chose to stay and be present in their role. So by the time March and April rolled around, I was confident enough to ask the president when he expected to name me to the role permanently. I still had the butterflies in my stomach that I always had when I sat on the couches in his office, but I thought I knew that I was doing the job well. I was surprised to hear him say that while he still intended to name me permanent, he and the board felt that it was necessary to do a search so that I had legitimacy in the role. I was confident but still trusting at this point and took him at his word. It stung. He was telling me what an excellent job I was doing as interim, but I decided to believe that it would work out in the end. We had already discussed salary, and I knew I'd be making about 20% more when I was named permanent, and I also knew the financial situation the university was in. The previous VP had been given a very generous package to leave the institution, so I figured that maybe it was a little bit of a financial decision as much as it was a referendum on my leadership ability or worth to the organization.
Ouch. A referendum on my leadership, Meghan?
I know. But, I was getting so much feedback. You're doing a great job. You're doing exactly what you want.
Yeah.
I had stopped the bleeding. Morale was so much better. There was a lot of trust in the department. And so I was getting all of these positive messages and at the same time being told, we're not quite ready for you to be permanent in this role.
Yeah. Wait your turn, honey.
Wait your turn, honey. Yes. Wait your turn, honey. Or, we're just going to wait a little bit longer to see if you drive off the glass cliff or not, because then we can bring somebody else in to fix it.
Right.
So, wait a little longer, honey. Yeah, on these, and I mean, the couches. So
yes, tell me about this is like a theme in the story, by the way. Go ahead, tell us.
So he had these couches, and if you've ever been in a institutional space where you order furniture from a catalog that's designed for offices, they're not comfy couches. Like, they look beautiful, but you can't get comfortable on these couches. So he had couches in his office. And he would always, when he brought you in to talk in his office, he always went to the couches. You never sat at the table. You never sat at his desk. You sat on the couches. And they were, I swear, they were curved wood.
Curved wood.
Not cushions. Like, it was wood that was curved to look like a cushion and had fabric on it, but they were hard and they were uncomfortable. And so invariably, it was a day you were wearing a skirt suit. So you were perched on the edge of it, like trying to keep your knees together, and you couldn't ever you couldn't sit back because they were deep but hard, and just the worst. And so that is, when I think about how uncomfortable this whole situation made me, I think about sitting on those couches.
Yeah.
Because it was the embodiment of discomfort.
Yeah. Completely. I have this visual in my head. I'm sure our listeners do too. Um, I want to ask the next question because it kind of fits in nicely. When fear and doubt got in the way of expressing yourself, what were the techniques to help you move through it?
So I have a good friend who worked with me at the same organization. So she left before I did. We worked together for about 3 years, and we've stayed friends. We've stayed connected. She's still in the industry, and I called her.
Yeah.
I called her and asked her to read a little bit of it. Um, Asked her to help me figure out if I was telling the story I wanted to tell,
Yeah.
if I was telling too much of the
Yeah.
story. You know, parts of this story are not mine to tell, as much as I would like to.
Yeah.
They're just not mine to tell. So, you know, I reached out to somebody else. I reached out to another woman who lived it, who knew kind of, she was with me through the whole thing. She left before my second interim role. Um, but that I think that connection, um, you know, initially the fear and doubt was, am I really going to be able to write this personal story? And talking
Yeah.
with the other women, the other collaborators,
Yeah.
was what got me to the point where I could put a pen on paper, or, you know, my hands on a keyboard. Um, and so I think it is that connection with other people who understand what you've gone through, even if they weren't there with you, who have similar stories to tell. I mean, Mogda's story,
Oh gosh.
it's not the same as my story,
No.
but I could feel how she was feeling.
Yeah.
And I knew she could feel how I was feeling in my story. And so that kind of connection, I think, is what made it possible to tell a story.
Yeah.
I mean, I could envision, you know, all of us doing this amazing tour around the country where we just invite women to circles to story tell,
I
right?
know.
Like, because
Maybe.
yeah, but I know that there are thousands upon thousands of women
Yeah.
who have these stories. And I mean, I think that's what makes it so powerful when you do finally put it down on paper.
Yeah. And you own it.
Yeah.
And you own it, right? It's
Yeah.
really interesting that when the fear and doubt kicks in, you reach out to your network, right? When
Yeah.
you're so that is a theme in women's leadership. And we've got some research we've been sharing about women and collaboration and how they think and how they work. I think it is unique because of the biological pieces behind it. And I think it really does make us stronger. Um, More about the process, because this was unique. Again, we were all writing together. I'm so encouraged and so inspired to hear about that, owning your narrative. First, we did it talking, right? The
Yeah.
first thing we did was
Yep.
talk through them all, the stories in groups of three, like Meghan mentioned, and then we wrote. The question, was there a moment during the process that something clicked for you? Something went, you know, when the gear shift goes and you know you're
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. So I came back from that talking exercise, and I sat down, and in the next session that we had for writing, I got something on paper, and I knew it wasn't the right something on paper.
Yeah.
You know, I was doing this chronological narrative. You know, just basically saying this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and I knew it wasn't right. I mean, I knew it was true, but it wasn't right. And I started thinking about how I felt through this process, and um, trying to put some sort of visual into the mix,
Okay.
because, you know, I didn't want to tell a story that was a laundry list. What I wanted was some way to bring people in to feel the experience.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I started thinking about those couches. And the couches were the click for me. When I connected how uncomfortable it was to sit on the couch, with how uncomfortable I was in this entire situation. That was the click for me.
Yeah.
It was probably 3 weeks later, 4 weeks later. And it was when I scheduled my 5-hour writing session. And I sat down, I spent the first maybe hour just thinking, how am I fixing this? Like, I
Yeah.
have this narrative, how am I
Yeah.
fixing it? But the couches were the linchpin. Like, I felt then that I had a story, not just a list or not just a chronology.
Yeah, that's really, I think that's our go-to too, right? Like our go-to is I was born here, I was raised here, I went to school here. It's all very safe, right? And when I talk
Yeah,
about leadership, I often talk about this sort of the facts, and then there's this meaningful moment that, and the transition into it, Megan, whether you're in person and you're doing, the tough HR stuff, whether you're
right.
doing fundraising, my old background, like all that, it's those transitions. And so it's kind of cool that the couch was the transition,
Yeah.
right?
And I thought I was starting at the end of the story. Like, when
Right.
I wrote the first paragraphs, I thought I was starting at the end of the story. And it turns out I was starting in the middle.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, so, and I got myself out of the chronological. I mean, it's still,
Yeah.
you understand the story I'm telling, but I'm not, this is when I was born and this is where I went to school. And I think for me, that click meant by the end of the 5 hours, I had my piece. I had my story. I took a couple more weeks to make sure, because I'm very deadline driven, as we've talked about, but I also know that I I can be quick, and quick is not always the best. So I just wanted to
Yeah.
live with it a little. I asked somebody else to read it,
Yeah.
and
I
yeah,
think I think the word you're going for is glib. It's like
yeah,
I'm kind of like that too, right? I can write something quick, and then you need a bit of space to go back and
yeah,
look at it objectively. And I can't wait for listeners to read these stories. I mean, they're fascinating. They're not what you'd expect. Well, I don't know what you would expect. Who knows what you're supposed to expect? But this isn't like a litany of Megan's accomplishments. It's a moment in time, which I think is so beautiful with all these little nuggets. They're like a moment, a little petri dish of leadership. There's learnings. I hear in your voice, Megan, your desire to impart that knowledge, to my younger self. This time I knew how to ask for things. Hopefully one of my things I always say to myself is every day I try and be a little bit better than yesterday. It's very simple, but it works, right?
yeah,
It really
yep.
works. I'm going to move to the collaboration aspect. How did the collaboration aspect shape the experience for you?
I don't think I could have told this story without our collaborators. Um, I think that, personal stories are personal, and it exists. Really, the story exists in the space between us, right? This is me sharing, but also at the same time, it's someone else receiving. And some of that back and forth shaped how I thought about the story I was telling, right? So I thought I was telling a story
Yeah.
about the 2 times I took an interim role in the same organization in 2 years. And why would I do that?
Yeah.
But in the conversation and the collaboration work that we did, I realized I was telling a story that was about growth, that was
Yeah.
about showing the process of growing in leadership, in personal confidence, in ability to advocate for myself. And I think if I hadn't had the collaborators that we had, I don't know that I would have seen. I don't know that I would have seen that in my story.
Yeah.
I've told this story before. This is something that happened to me. I've told this story before. It is something very different in this iteration because of the collaboration and the relationship and the space between and among all of us collaborators.
The way I was describing it was, God, do we ever underestimate the power of listening? And how, when we truly, one of the experiences I had, and I'm going to do my episodes coming up as well, was having my story told back to me. Megan, did you have, that was like mind blowing, right?
Because the things I thought were important were not the things that the listener thought were important in the story. I mean, yeah, the word interim mattered, but so many of the like I was holding on to these things that just were not the gist of the story that I had
Yeah.
told. But I couldn't hear it.
No.
I couldn't hear it.
And so, I think of all the ways, whether it's, working with executive coaches, let's go to therapy, right? Not that those two are interconnected in any way, but same concept of a
Yeah,
girlfriends holding space, or co-leaders or collaborative women. And, the quality of the person and the integrity of the person across from you when you tell the story does matter, because they interpret it. If they know you, they interpret it in a way and they share it back to you, and you get a chance to cherry pick and say, oh, you're right. I think too, we underestimate ourselves a heck of a lot. And so
yeah,
a lot of these stories were about having taken things, not your story, but everybody's, things on the chin, or accepted things as such. And
yeah,
somebody mirrors it back and says, holy crap, you did what? And you're like,
yeah.
yeah, that's just what I did to survive.
Just what I did.
It's just what I did,
Well,
right?
so, or it's just what happened to me versus
Right.
it's what I did. Like that was a big learning for me. It's not what happened to me. It's what I chose to do. But yeah, and because I was thinking of it as something that happened to me, and
Right.
my listener was thinking of it as something I chose to do.
What's that word? Radical responsibility, right? Ownership
Yeah,
of our choices,
yeah,
embodiment, to use your word. I am rather than I do or I be.
yeah.
So such a great theme. Okay, last question. And this is kind of a loaded question, but let's go for it. What's the biggest takeaway from this experience for you?
You know, I think the biggest takeaway, and this is something that I learned in my research, um, that's been reiterated for me in this process of writing a collaborative book about women's leadership, is that there are so many more things that unite us in our lived experience. And we need to talk to each other about it. We need to have these open, honest conversations and say, this is what happened to me. This is what I did. This is where I am. This is my experience.
Hmm.
Because it builds bridges. It creates opportunities. It does teach those that are coming behind us. They still need to have the experiences, but the idea that we're not alone, that
Mm,
there's not something wrong with us, that this was our experience. We didn't do anything wrong.
yeah.
It's huge. I mean, it takes such a burden off of you when you realize it's not just me. And I think that that's the biggest takeaway from this experience. And I hope that that is the
Yeah.
experience that readers take away from the book, or listeners from this
Yeah.
podcast, because working collaboratively, working in community, I think is our best way forward.
It's been a joy to spend some time with you, Megan. Thank you for your wise words, for your story, your gift of story to all those people out there. For those of you listening, remember this collaborative book about women's leadership, which currently has no title, but will have a title very soon, is coming out fall of 2023. In the show notes, you'll find some information about how you can get on the wait list to get first copies of that incredible book that's coming out. If you want to connect with Meghan Rehbein, Dr. Rehbein, there's contact information for her at the end as well. And you know what? I wasn't planning on this, but you know what I'd love to hear from people is, if you have a story that
Mm,
you want shared, let's start expressing ourselves that way. So that might be to an email, jenny@chavender.com. That's Chavender like lavender. And I will commit to sharing with the other women in the book some of these stories. Because Megan, I am really inspired by that ending that you mentioned, the "we are not alone" piece. And the stories define us until we speak them out loud. And I can only imagine, we have a variety of women that are coming on for the 12, 13 episodes. And each of our stories is worthy. Each of our stories is unique. But I agree, Megan, there's more commonalities than there are differences in this experience. Yeah.
Yeah. And Jenny, I just have to thank you for having the idea and making this happen, because it is, I mean, I think it's one of the coolest things I have ever done.
I love it. It's pretty cool. I must
It's
admit,
pretty cool.
it's pretty cool. And you'll hear more about my story, about my conundrums about getting things right or doing things right. So we'll have some great conversations there. Megan, have a great day. Good night. Goodbye, everybody listening. Thanks so much. And stay tuned for another episode. We'll be back soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.